After my video on East Germany, the country my mother was from, I got a couple supportive comments telling me that I should continue personalizing my videos. So I figured what better way to do this than with a video on Peru, the country my father is from. You might have recently seen videos coming out of Peru of massive youth-led protests being violently repressed. But specifically why people are protesting isn't always made clear. In the media that most of us in the global north are exposed to, the reason for the protests is almost always chalked up to against corruption or against crime, but this doesn't encompass the entire story, and can make the protests seem so vague that people could think they don't have a specific goal. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. A brief history of Peru and its development, and then specifically what it is the protesters are demanding. Journalists should be striving to inform their readers and explain the context behind why things are happening, especially when some of these journalists are working in countries who have vested political and economic interests in making sure that the protests continue being repressed. The fact is that protests are repressed by the police around the world every single day. If someone reads some of these articles, they're going to forget by tomorrow when they read a similar story happening in another country. But to explain why things are happening, to connect them to the reader's lives, when something is properly understood, it is harder to forget, and that's what I'm going to be trying to do today. What today is known as Peru was, like the rest of the Americas, inhabited by various different groups of indigenous people, all with their own distinct cultures, languages, traditions, and identities. Before the arrival of the Spanish, the Incan Empire ruled over much of the land that would become Peru. Unfortunately for the Incas, the Spanish did arrive and felt that the land and the indigenous people could be used to generate wealth for the Spanish Empire. The Queen of Spain agreed, officially gave her permission for the land to be conquered, and after a war, the Spanish captured and executed the final leader of the Incan Empire, Atahualpa, before setting up a short-lived Incan puppet state run by collaborators. Indigenous resistance continued for the following decades, most notably by Tupac Amaru, which went on to be the inspiration for the name of American rapper and political activist Tupac Amaru Shakur. The Spanish established the Kingdom of Peru, an imperial viceroyalty that put the indigenous people to work, mostly mining gold and silver to be exported to Spain. On top of this, the culture, language, and religion of indigenous people were suppressed in this new viceroyalty. The architecture of the Incan people was deliberately destroyed and replaced with Spanish architecture. People were forced to convert to Christianity. Quechua, the language of the Incan Empire, was replaced with Spanish, and bit by bit, the indigenous people were Europeanized. On top of this, like what had happened in much of the rest of the Americas, diseases that indigenous people had no resistance to killed millions. In a period of just 45 years, the population of indigenous people went from 12 million to 1 million. And this feels like the perfect time to insert a clip from one of my favorite movies, The Motorcycle Diaries, a movie and a book that I would recommend to everyone.
Los incas tenían un alto conocimiento en astronomía, medicina, matemática, entre otras cosas. Pero los invasores españoles tenían la pólvora. ¿Cómo sería América hoy si las cosas hubieran sido diferentes? ¿Cómo es posible que sienta nostalgia por un mundo que no conocí? ¿Cómo se explica que una civilización capaz de construir esto sea arrasada para construir esto?
The viceroyalty continued to exploit the indigenous people until the early 1800s, when much of South America had begun to rebel against Spanish colonial rule. After decades of war, José de San Martín declared Peru's independence in 1821, Spain renounced its claim over its territories in the Americas in 1836, and finally signed a treaty recognizing Peru's independence in 1879. Now today, Peru is a third world country. 30% of Peruvians live in poverty. There are not a lot of job opportunities for young people. The healthcare system is severely underfunded. There is lots of violence, not just political violence, but also random street violence. And more than anything, what Peru is there for in relation to the rest of the world, specifically the United States and Europe, is cheap labor. Some of the biggest companies in the world who produce everything from sodas to medicines manufacture their products in Peru because it is cheap. Peru is one of the world's largest exports of gold, copper, and zinc, all of which has helped Peru's mining industry grow, at the expense, of course, of all the forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking that is used to sustain it. On paper, Peru's economy has grown over the last few decades, but in reality, most of that money is being sent back to Europe and to the US, or stays in the hands of very few people who own the factories. And worst of all, its government is completely corrupt, and close to no politicians have any interest in changing it. What I just said could be applied to, with a few adjustments, to many countries in the global south. But why is that? When talking about the poverty of countries that used to be victims of colonization and imperial occupation, some groups of people make the excuse, yeah, they suffered and were exploited then, but that was 200 years ago. You can't keep blaming everything on something that happened centuries before you were born. When a country from the third world is being compared to a country in the first, it's important to start with the beginning, as in, what were the conditions of the country when it first started to develop itself? The USA, for example, started as a colony of the most powerful empire in the entire world at the time, a colony that, unlike Peru, was not used to only extract natural resources and labor, but actively had money and slaves poured into it to develop its economy to a point that it no longer had to rely on the British Empire. For a person from these countries, whose development was directly linked to the exploitation of resources and labor abroad, to compare their level of development with that of countries that they exploited, and then be shocked that the people in the latter are not living at the same level as those in the former, really shows how disconnected they are from each other's reality. If the United States, Spain, and the UK started their development from nothing, Peru and other countries in the global south who started their development at the moment of liberation from colonial rule started from less than nothing. But of course, the effects of colonialism don't just disappear when the colonizer does. Because after centuries of exploitation, the newly independent country is dropped into a power vacuum and has to build up its new government, its economy, institutions, and infrastructure. Things don't just magically get better at the point of independence, but are usually followed by a very long period of political instability. In the case of Peru, a very long series of civil wars between different parts of Peru, as well as a series of wars against the other newly independent countries in Latin America, like Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, not only killed tens of thousands of people, but also prevented the country from fully focusing on its own development for decades. Because of the history of colonization, as well as the numerous wars that Peru and other South American countries fought in after independence, these countries suffered political instability for years. Political instability that was taken advantage of and at times exacerbated by the United States to more easily influence the political development of these countries to be more favorable to American interests. In a paper written for the journal Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences by Carolina Curvale, a professor of political science in Ecuador, she measures political instability in Latin American countries post-independence by analyzing the predictability of governments. Among other factors, for example, if a president is elected for a certain term, do they serve the entire term? How many presidents serve their elected terms consecutively without being interrupted by a coup or a revolution, and so on. And in her conclusion, she writes, after overcoming the fights for independence from colonial power, Latin American countries experimented both with governmental forms and territorial units. Building stable institutions, when at least 2 consecutive terms could be completed, was possible only after an average 46 years of turmoil. In addition, she finds that when measuring the length of constitutional stability, the 1886 Constitution of Colombia has lasted the longest in Latin America, only 105 years, while most other countries have lasted just a fraction of that. In around 200 years of independence, Venezuela has had 25 constitutions, Ecuador has had 21, Bolivia has had 19, and Peru has had 17. For reference, these are the longest held constitutions still in effect today, all of which exist in either the US or other European countries, and most of whom have been in effect since independence for most of Latin America. Additionally, 43% of countries that transitioned to dictatorships between 1946 and 2002 were Latin American countries, and between 1850 and 1949, Latin American countries experienced 184 coups. In Peru alone, in just over 200 years of independence, there have been 13 coups against the government, with the last one occurring in 1992, still influencing Peruvian politics to this day. But before we get to that, we have to talk about two other coups in Peruvian history, starting in 1968. The president at the time had been Fernando Belaunde, your typical conservative, right-wing, pro-American liberal, who, while implementing some basic social reforms that helped people, had his first term in office marked with controversy. For one, Belaunde was directly involved in the massacre of indigenous people who were protesting against the destruction of their homes in the Amazon rainforest, and for two, he was also directly implicated in a scandal where pages of a contract detailing the financial relationship between a Peruvian state-owned company and a Canadian oil company that had not only not been paying taxes, but had also been operating on land that didn't belong to it. In 1968, the military of Peru had begun to fear that the instability and unpopularity of the government would in turn lead to the growing popularity of the communist guerrillas who were advocating for a people's war. So they decided to coup the government. The leader of this coup, who was the dictator for the following 7 years, was military general Juan Velasco Alvarado. But to everyone's surprise, Alvarado didn't just repress communists and leftists and continue the path that Belaunde and those before him had set out, but had real interest in actually changing the country. Alvarado was an open anti-communist, but he was more willing to allow leftists into his government, and he saw the growing inequality in Peruvian society as a threat to national security. Under his government, Peru had implemented the largest land reform policies in all of Latin America, second only to Cuba, a policy that helped hundreds of thousands of peasants who were still living on haciendas. In addition, Quechua as a language had been recognized as an official language of Peru, and for the first time, bilingual schools were established. But what really made the capitalists in Peru and the US mad, more than the land reforms, was his nationalization of private companies like the Canadian oil company that hadn't been paying taxes, with close to no compensation for the former owners. Even though Alvarado had clearly rejected communism in his speeches, his government's friendly relationship with Cuba and the Soviet Union, as well as the nationalizations and land reforms, as well as his explicit rejection of capitalism as well, was enough for the US and Europe to condemn him as a communist. Even though his policies did help a lot of people, a lot of the economic problems he inherited persisted, and by the mid-70s, with virtually all of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Peru united against him, he was overthrown in another coup in 1975, led by Francisco Bermudez, another general of the Peruvian military. And unfortunately for Peruvians, Bermudez was virtually the opposite of Alvarado. Where Alvarado had rejected American involvement in Peru, Bermudez welcomed it, putting a stop to Alvarado's progressive economic reforms and willingly becoming a part of the US's Operation Condor. Where Alvarado had protected the language of indigenous people, Bermudez erased them completely in the new constitution. So Peru was basically back to where it was before Alvarado's coup, except with a government that was much more willing to use violence to repress communists and leftists, and much more aligned with the US. And it stayed this way basically until 1990, when Alberto Fujimori won the Peruvian national elections. Now, in the 70s and 80s, Peru was dealing with what would basically become a mini civil war. Economic instability was high, and different political groups had begun to declare war against the Peruvian state. One of these groups was the Shining Path, a self-proclaimed Maoist party that declared a people's war against the government. Now, I have a lot of opinions about the Shining Path, opinions that go far beyond the scope of this video, so that will probably be another video that I'll make sometime in the future, analyzing their party structure and their ideology and what they actually did. But all I'll say here that's relevant to the general Peruvian public that maybe wasn't so involved in politics is that the Shining Path's way of doing a people's war against the state was not just a political struggle, but included things like putting bombs in civilian centers, killing random people while they were at work, massacring entire villages of people, including infants, that resisted them, and killing dogs and other street animals just to hang their corpses on street signs. And the police and the military that was sent in to repress the Shining Path was just as, if not even more, brutal and random with their violence. People were poor, tired, and terrified about what was going to happen next. And it was exactly just this situation that led Fujimori, someone who basically only ran on the platform that he would stop crime, to become the president in 1990. Behind the scenes, however, the Peruvian military was already developing Plan Verde, a path to establish a military government that would forcefully implement the same neoliberal economic model that had been implemented by force in Pinochet's Chile. In addition, Plan Verde called for the repression of journalists and political dissidents, more power to the military, police, and security forces, and a self-described complete extermination of impoverished Peruvians as well as groups deemed culturally backward. Originally, this was planned to be done through a coup d'etat, but when Fujimori won the election, the military just asked his right-hand man, Vladimir Montesinos, who I'll get back to in a bit, if Fujimori would adopt these policies, which he enthusiastically did. Fujimori continued implementing his economic reforms until 1992, when Congress finally started showing some resistance to the austerity he was planning on implementing, policies that had been recommended to him by the IMF. Since Fujimori had basically run his campaign and government in service of business interests and giving more power to the police and the military, these two groups supported him when he couped his own government.
Como presidente de la República, he constatado directamente todas estas anomalías y me he sentido en la responsabilidad de asumir una actitud de excepción para procurar acelerar el proceso de esta reconstrucción nacional, por lo que he decidido tomar las siguientes trascendentales medidas. Primero, disolver temporalmente el Congreso de la República hasta la aprobación de una nueva estructura orgánica del Poder Legislativo, la que se aprobará mediante un plebiscito nacional.
Now that he had effectively become a dictator, he could implement virtually any economic policies he wanted to, as well as write a new constitution, one of the biggest issues still affecting Peru to this day. Peru's 1993 constitution includes an article in it that makes the Congress more important than the rest of the government. Thanks to Article 113 of Peru's constitution, Congress has the power to impeach the president due to moral incapacity, a term left intentionally as vague as possible so that they can basically do it anytime they want. For example, during Pedro Castillo's time as president, who I'll talk about in just a minute, in just 14 months, Congress tried to impeach him 3 times due to moral incapacity. In addition, the new Peruvian constitution effectively codified the free market neoliberal economic reforms of Fujimori into law. This constitution is clearly written in such a way that any attempt from a politician to interfere in the economy that Fujimori set up can be easily declared as unconstitutional and removed from office, even if changing that policy is supported by the people that voted for them and got them into office in the first place. Under Fujimori's new government, the military's Plan Verde could now be fully implemented. Implementing neoliberal reforms recommended by the IMF and the World Bank, inequality in Peru continued to grow. While the ruling class saw a massive increase in their wealth and the small Peruvian middle class began to see some stability, the vast majority of Peruvians who were living in poverty continued to lose the little they had. Virtually all government restrictions on investment and capital were removed, hundreds of state-owned companies were sold off for cheap, and the Peruvian economy had been converted to basically that of Chile's during Pinochet's dictatorship. For most Peruvians, the cost of things like electricity, water, and food were simply unaffordable. And as more and more Peruvians couldn't afford daily necessities, the political repression continued. There were regular massacres of entire villages and neighborhoods where suspected Shining Path members or suspected communists were staying at. Journalists and the media were completely suppressed, and it was common for anyone who spoke out against the government to be forcefully disappeared. And then, of course, there was the genocide of Peru's indigenous and impoverished population laid out in Plan Verde that Fujimori enthusiastically took a part of. Peru's health ministry took a part in a forced sterilization campaign of mostly poor, indigenous, or illiterate women to intentionally exterminate the population, a program that has been described as genocide and affected as many as 300,000 Peruvians. The US government was, of course, fully aware of what was happening and chose to keep funding it. After the genocide was out in the open, the US did the little dance it always does where it claims they had no idea, but reports from both within Peru and independent researchers concluded that the internal archives of USAID show that in 1993, the United States basically took charge of the national health system of Peru. The bilateral accord of 1993 that put the United States in such an advantageous position, known as Project 2000, was signed by the Peruvian and American authorities in September 1993 and was effective for 7 years, ending in 2000. An examination of this document shows that USAID Peru, the office in Lima of USAID, was in any conceivable form in control of the Peruvian health sector before and during the years the abuses took part. It should be noted that Fujimori was not acting completely alone, but was supported the entire time by Vladimiro Montesinos, the head of Peru's national security, who studied in the infamous School of the Americas, had deep connections to the CIA throughout his career, including being convicted of spying on the Peruvian government for the USA, and who even journalists working for the BBC reported, effectively ran Peru from the shadows. In fact, after the genocide that Fujimori carried out against the indigenous people of Peru, a genocide that Montesinos was directly involved in as the head of national security, the CIA sent him a letter admiring his leadership, dedication, and professionalism. Of course, this professionalism they're referring to is in service of creating an unstable country that can be more easily manipulated to serve foreign interests rather than the people who actually live in the country. Fujimori continued his dictatorship until the year 2000, when the repression and corruption became so obvious that it was impossible to pretend otherwise, so he did what most Latin American dictators did, got on a plane, and flew to the West. But the effect of his dictatorship and his new constitution on Peru, even until today, is clear as day. We can observe this just by looking at the presidents that followed Fujimori, who close to all of whom have been neoliberals who have more or less willingly continued the economic path that Fujimori set out, and some of whom have openly defended his dictatorship. To give you an idea of how bad it's been, his children Kenji and Keiko have both been elected to Congress and both openly support their father, with Keiko very nearly becoming president in the last election. Alejandro Toledo was the leader of the opposition following Fujimori's presidency, who served as president for 5 years before fleeing to the United States after being discovered that he had been accepting tens of millions of dollars in bribes from foreign companies. He was succeeded by Alan Garcia, who became the president for the second time before killing himself to avoid arrest after being implicated in a massive corruption scandal. The following two presidents, Ollanta Humala and Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, were both implicated in the same bribery and money laundering scandal, and after them, Martin Vizcarra was not only implicated in another corruption scandal, but it was also revealed that he and his close family and friends had gotten COVID vaccinations months before it was available to the Peruvian public, something that made people extremely mad because Peru's severely underdeveloped and underfinanced healthcare system had allowed Peru to become the country with the highest rate of COVID deaths in the entire world. After Vizcarra's impeachment, Manuel Merino became the president for literally only 5 days before stepping down, after which he was investigated for human rights abuses because the police had killed protesters that had come out to demonstrate against his incredibly unpopular choice as president. At this point, Peru has had corrupt, incompetent neoliberal after corrupt, incompetent neoliberal for years, which is why it was such a surprise that in 2021, Pedro Castillo, an unknown indigenous man, ran a campaign focusing on wealth inequality in the country and barely won the presidential election against Keiko Fujimori. The COVID-19 pandemic had really highlighted just how bad of a state most Peruvians had been living in, and his background as a teacher in an extremely poor part of Peru made many Peruvians, especially the indigenous and those in rural areas, identify with his message. And the thing is, Pedro Castillo was not at all an extremist or even a communist. He advocated for putting some restrictions on Peru's completely open free market economy, on developing independent Peruvian state-owned companies, instead of exporting all the food produced in Peru, planning for some of that food to be eaten by actual Peruvians, and increasing the funding for education and healthcare. All of these things are very basic policies that would have helped hundreds of thousands of people. But in Peru's mainstream, even this was enough for Castillo to be called a communist. And in Peru, if you're a communist, you're a terrorist. So even though he won the presidential election off of the support of the country's poor and indigenous people, most of the Peruvian upper class, people who lived in cities like Lima, capitalists, and the same military and police that had served Fujimori, absolutely hated him. As soon as he got into office, the endless coverage on Peruvian TV started constantly pushing the same message. Castillo is incompetent, he doesn't keep his campaign promises, and if you were listening to a particularly right-wing channel, they probably also called him a terrorist. Obviously, many of the promises Castillo made during his campaign would be impossible to keep because they directly interfere with many of Fujimori's economic policies and are thus considered unconstitutional. He was constantly impeded throughout his term from really doing anything by Congress. As his term went on, he continued picking out new ministers that were increasingly more right-wing to seem more acceptable to Congress. That also made it harder and harder to put forward any coherent plans or policies. During his presidency, he raised the minimum wage, arranged faster arrivals for desperately needed COVID-19 vaccines, and some very minor agricultural reforms that included zero expropriations. But even with these minor things, Peru's Congress tried to impeach him 3 times. After the 3rd attempt, Castillo announced that he was going to dissolve Congress and write a new constitution. Obviously, with little institutional support, this failed coup attempt fell apart immediately. I have no idea if he actually thought this was going to work, but nevertheless, this, in the way he carried it out, was a pretty bad idea. Now, before anyone compares Fujimori to Castillo, or bizarrely Trump to Castillo, as many Western journalists have, even though they were taking the same action, the context was very different. When Castillo ran for president, he very explicitly said he wanted to draft a new constitution, and people liked that policy and voted for it. In fact, drafting a new constitution is an incredibly common position to hold, especially today, almost 3 years after his attempt to do exactly that. It would have been a coup against an incredibly unpopular government, Congress, and constitution by the democratically elected president of that government, who was being actively impeded by Congress from carrying out any of his campaign promises. Unfortunately though, Castillo, who had no support in the military or in the business elites, was arrested and remains in jail to this day. I also want to say, I don't mean to make it sound like Pedro Castillo was going to single-handedly fix Peru, or that he was perfect or anything. After his arrest for the attempted coup, it was announced that he would be investigated for being allegedly the head of an organized crime syndicate. But for a government who so clearly wanted him removed from office since the beginning, with national media that was accusing him or his family almost every day during his campaign of being a secret Shining Path member or a secret drug dealer, this could also just be nothing. Pedro Castillo would not have magically fixed Peru, but I wanted to spend some time on his presidency to highlight how even the smallest reform to Peru's system is basically made impossible by the system itself. I hope that by now I've made it very clear that despite having moments of peace here and there, Peru has been very politically unstable for decades and continues to be unstable to this day. This type of instability and frequency of corruption is by no means exclusive to Peru or to Latin America. The scars of colonialism have affected the political stability of many other countries around the world. When slaves in Haiti revolted against the French, not only did they suffer political and economic isolation from France and the US for years, but France also charged them with millions of euros in today's currency of debt that Haiti had to and did pay back to the very people that had enslaved them, a debt that crippled the financial situation of Haiti to this day. When the British finally left India, The partition between Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan killed millions of people and displaced tens of millions. After German and Belgian colonial officials exacerbated tensions between Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda by giving Tutsis specific ethnic privileges, the racial tensions between these two groups led to the Rwandan genocide decades after independence. The British only occupied Palestine for 30 years, and partly because of a decision they made 110 years ago, it has enabled Israel to unleash unending violence on millions of people in Palestine and the countries surrounding it, culminating in a genocide happening today. And after Syria gained its independence from France, the government was couped 3 times in a single year, and then 6 more times in the following 2 decades. All of these conditions, a debt so large that it took more than a century to pay it off and lead to even more debts, the loss of homes of tens of millions of people, the creation and the direct encouragement of ethnic tensions between people who used to live together, endless coups, many of these are artificially created situations that grow and feed into the political instability left by colonialism. And most important of all, political instability makes these countries easier to manipulate. It makes it easier for certain political interests to gain prominence in these countries' politics, especially if the people who are supportive of those political interests can fund politicians who can push them. Genocides, wars, coups, it is all completely unimportant to the West as long as none of the violence suffered by Peruvians or any of the people in the global South affects these countries' industries and the economic policies that allow foreign capital and foreign direct investment to prevent the development of an independent Peruvian economy that is not subservient to Americans and Europeans. So, with the history of Peru out of the way, let's get into the protests today and what has caused them. Following the arrest of Pedro Castillo, his vice president, Dina Boluarte, ascended to the presidency. For many supporters of Castillo, his arrest was just a confirmation of what they already knew, that the government was corrupt and that the person they elected to change it had been arrested for doing something about it. Dina Boluarte, as his vice president, had promised to vacate the office if Castillo was to be impeached, a risk that they were both aware of during their campaign. Except, when it happened, she did a complete 180. She denounced the party that she and Castillo had been a part of, she denounced Castillo, his policies, and his attempt to change the constitution. Immediately, protests broke out across Peru following her swearing in as president, with people demanding that Pedro Castillo be freed and that Boluarte, the unelected president, be removed from office. And the police, acting on her orders, repressed the protests violently, resulting in massacres from Uriaca to Ayacucho, with multiple protesters being shot in the head by the police and the military. And this was only in the first 2 months of her presidency. Unlike Pedro Castillo, the government of Dina Boluarte completely ignored the party and the people who had gotten her into office, and continued the path that many Latin American dictators had followed before her, allowing for unimpeded neoliberalism and embezzling money from the government. Now I want to interject here with a little personal story that might be of interest to some of you. Dina Boluarte actually came to Berlin towards the end of 2023 and had a meeting with some members of the German government. Now, I was unfortunately not in Berlin while she visited, but the Peruvians in Berlin were pissed that she came here. The entire time that she had her meeting and her tour of German museums, Peruvians came out to protest against her, directly accusing her of complicity in the murder of protesters.
Dina, no te escondas. Dina, tu gobierno está matando gente. La gente no te quiere. Alemania no te quiere. Te repudia. Los peruanos en Alemania te repudian. No regreses.
This was well after the massacres at Juliaca and Ayacucho had become public knowledge, and the German government, knowing full well that this incredibly unpopular president was directly involved with these massacres, still felt comfortable enough inviting her to Berlin, shaking her hand, and giving her a tour of the city, even in front of the real Peruvians living in Germany, protesting her presence. This acceptance is extended out to her because her government was much more obedient to American and European economic interests than Pedro Castillo's government would have been, had he been allowed to do anything without the interference of Congress. Compare the treatment she received to someone like Miguel Díaz-Canel or Xi Jinping. both of whom are constantly called a dictator in Western media, despite Diaz-Canal being elected to office in accordance with the Constitution of Cuba, which was overwhelmingly voted on and approved on by the Cuban people, and Xi Jinping, who enjoys significantly more support from the Chinese population than Boluarte's presidency or the entire Congress of Peru has from the Peruvian people. And you would think, coming from these countries with this allegedly free and fair media that's just about informing people, that their president had just met with someone involved in the mass murder of civilian protesters and was followed around by Peruvians protesting her presence and calling her a murderer would at least be something worth writing about, right? Well, that would have caused Germans to ask themselves some uncomfortable questions. So the German media dealt with this little incident the same way that it dealt with the global Sumud flotilla being illegally intercepted by Israel and humanitarian activists, some of which had German passports, being held and tortured by Israel, that being not reporting on it at all. Dina Boluarte was and remains the world's most unpopular leader. For most of her time as president, her approval rating was barely around 5%, and by the end of it, it was barely 2%. In September of 2025, she passed a new pension reform that required all Peruvians to sign up with a private pension fund, where contributions to the fund were not required, and also completely restricted access to these funds under a certain age. What started as youth-led protests against this law grew and grew until suddenly, all the repressed anger against the injustice and corruption and the murders from the police and the poverty of the last 20 years just came to the surface, and more people around Peru came to Lima to protest against the government. Part of the reason the protests have been so effective this time around is because more than just the chaos of the protests themselves, they've had real economic consequences for Peru. A few days into the protests, some mines have had to shut down because they're scared of what might happen to them, and Peruvian fishermen, up to 90,000 of them, have started striking in solidarity with the protests. Now, Peru has a big fishing industry, but its mining industry is incredibly important, and I'm sure these two acts, along with more and more countries implementing serious travel warnings for Peru, have and will seriously affect Peru's economy. On the 11th of October, Dina Boluarte was finally impeached by Congress, but was replaced by none other than the president of Peru's incredibly unpopular Congress, José Geri, who was already involved in a bribery and illicit enrichment scandal and is currently under investigation for sexual assault. The president of Peru went from a murderer to a rapist. Obviously, Peruvians were not happy with the decision, and the protesters continued, demanding that Geri be removed as president, and either that Castillo be freed and reinstated, or that new elections be called. What is clear, however, is that Peru's Congress and its constitution is right now almost as unpopular as Dina Boluarte's was. One of the most popular slogans of this current protest is "Que se vayan todos," or everyone has to go. The president, the Congress, the ministers, the constitution, the entire corrupt government. There is no way to reform a constitution and a government that was intentionally created to be as corrupt and easily to manipulate as Peru's. Peru, and especially its youth, is demanding to build a new government from scratch, one that is not built for the interests of the US, Europe, and the few wealthy Peruvians who live in their mansions completely disconnected from the rest of the country. That is why it's completely dishonest for all these Western journalists that work for BBC and CNN to just simply write, oh, it's against corruption in the government, or it's against crime. No, the protests are against very specific things. They want to change the entire government, the entire corrupt government. They're not just protesting against crime. Not even a week into Geri's time as president, the police have already killed someone, a 32-year-old man with a 9-year-old son by the name of Eduardo Mauricio Ruiz Sanz. Before he died, Eduardo was very involved in Peru's hip-hop scene, and a lot of the people who knew him and his music have come out to honor his life. There is a video of the murder happening that is hard to watch, so I won't play it, but an undercover cop, who is dressed in civilian clothing, runs out of a crowd of protesters down a street, and before turning the corner, turns around for a second, blindly fires his gun into a crowd, and ends Eduardo's life. And that's where Peru is today. José Geri has already announced that he will focus his presidency on fighting crime, and is supported virtually only by a Congress that is as unpopular as he is.
Pero esto se acabó. Hoy empezamos a cambiar la historia en la lucha contra la inseguridad en el Perú. El estado de emergencia aprobado por el Consejo de Ministros entra en vigencia a las 00 horas y por 30 días en Lima Metropolitana y el Callao. Y presenta un nuevo enfoque. Pasamos de la defensiva a la ofensiva en la lucha contra el crimen. Una lucha que nos permitirá recuperar la paz, la tranquilidad y la confianza de millones de peruanos. Las guerras se ganan con acciones, no con palabras. ¡Viva el Perú! ¡Viva!
What is happening today in Peru is not something that will just simmer out and eventually everything goes back to normal. Right now, Peru's ruling elite is beginning to realize that they cannot keep running the country the way they have been. The corruption and the violence has been so blatant that the current constitution cannot stand. But the real question is, what will come next? Peru will either continue shifting to the right, with either a Keiko Fujimori victory in the next election, or possibly even another military government led by generals who were collaborators of Fujimori and Montesinos, or the protesters will achieve their goals, and a new constitution and government will be formed that will finally be able to choose its own path forward, and not just the one set by Fujimori, Montesinos, and the CIA. And the future of Peru is incredibly important, especially in these days when the United States and Europe are so clearly trying their hardest to manufacture consent for a war against Venezuela and possibly even Colombia. It's very easy when hearing about random protests in the news to dismiss it as just another protest, something happening on the other side of the world. People say it's a Peru problem, and it's partly true, only Peruvians in Peru will be the ones to solve it, but it is a problem that affects the whole world. Because right now, to the US and Europe, the presidency of Dina Boluarte and José Geri, the most unpopular presidents in the world, both unelected, is considered a democracy. And the people and the military who shoot protesters and journalists are the ones defending that democracy. So it's time to start asking difficult questions about who exactly our democracies are working for. Because how can it be that for decades, people vote, politicians and parties change, and no matter what, Peru, and other countries as well, continue on a clear path downwards for the rest of us, no matter who is in office. And if we examine all of our democracies closer and realize that they are in fact not working for all of us, what are we going to do about it? I'm going to end this video with a speech given by a young Peruvian at a memorial for Eduardo Mauricio Ruiz Sanz. And before I play it, I want to just say Peru, as one of the most Christian countries in the world, is also pretty homophobic. And in the speech you're about to hear, the man giving the speech uses words that a lot of the people watching this are not used to hearing in political speeches, including a slur for gay people. I debated not including the video at all, but the speech has been reposted by many of the protesters and the Peruvian journalists that I follow, and is clearly positively received by many of the demonstrators. So in an effort to keep with trying to authentically depict Peru in this video, problems and all, I've kept the video in. Because whether the man in the video is homophobic or not, the struggle of Peruvians against their government so they can build a better economy and raise millions of Peruvians out of poverty will inevitably help gay people. When people are not living in a constant state of insecurity, when they have the opportunity to go to school, they get to question their own beliefs, and eventually homophobia and sexism will be easier to deal with in Peruvian society. I'll also write a comment under this video explaining some of the specific names and examples he gives so that you can better understand the speech with the Peruvian context.
Yo me niego a creer, al menos desde mi posición, que para que haya el cambio que queremos tienen que morir, tiene que haber Intis, tiene que haber Bryans, tiene que haber trucos, no tiene que pasar así, mano, no tiene por qué ser así. Yo soy de Trujillo, no quiero meter a todos en el mismo saco, pero la gente que es de provincia no me dejará mentir. Hay un calor distinto en nosotros, hay una frialdad en la gente de Lima, y tal vez no lo que estamos acá, pero tristemente sí en las personas que toman la mayoría de decisiones en este país, y son las que deciden, y las que por alguna razón no quieren que esto cambie porque están muy cómodos, porque es muy fácil hablar cuando tienes todo, es muy fácil hablar cuando te regalan todo, es muy fácil hablar cuando puedes violar, atropellar, asesinar, y al final tu viejito con una llamada te arregla todo. Es muy fácil hablar cuando el dolor no te toca, es muy fácil, y todas esas personas que no quieren que esto cambie, son así, hermano. Son así, y está bien. ¿Saben qué? A esas 130 ratas les quiero decir una cosa de todo corazón de parte de mi grupo, y al menos de parte de toda la gente que hace hip hop. Quédense con su plata, atragántense y váyanse a la mierda y que les dure. Nosotros tenemos huevos, nuestras mujeres tienen ovarios, y esa mierda no se compra, hijo de puta. Esa mierda no se compra. Es fácil hablar con el roquete de Alejandro Cabero, cobra 15 lucas, más 11 lucas de representación, y hay niños en Ayacucho hasta el día de hoy, que hay inteligencia artificial. Hay niños de este tamaño cargando un balde para lavar sus putos platos, ni siquiera para su ropa. ¿Les parece justo? Nos llaman extremistas, ¿Saben qué es extremista? Que de cada 10 niños menores de 4 años, 3 tengan anemia. Eso es extremista. ¿Saben qué es extremista? Que el ex gordo de mierda, el alcalde que hemos tenido, perdone violadores como Cipriani. Eso es extremista. Que muchas personas no hayan podido enterrar a sus hijos y a sus hermanas. Eso es extremista. Y en nombre del hip hop, y para los familiares de Truco que merecen mucho respeto, han perdido un hijo, pero han ganado un picho de hijos porque toda la comunidad hip hop está con ustedes, carajo.
Thank you for watching this video on Peru. I hope you learned something about Peru's history and that you now have a better understanding about the current protests that are happening. I'd like to thank the many journalists and reporters who have been reporting about the protests on the ground and taking all the pictures and videos you have seen in this video. This wouldn't have been possible without them, so all of their names and where you can find them are in the description. If you want to follow for more updates about these protests and more on-the-ground videos, I would recommend you check them out. Honestly, this video was very draining to make. It is the fastest I've ever written a script this long, but it also felt very different to write about these things that my family lived through, and seeing all the footage of the violence happening in Lima, in places that my dad and my cousins and I have memories in, is a strange feeling. Obviously, the level of police violence is much worse in Peru than in Berlin, but when police violence happens here, I can at least interact with it. I'm in the city, I can do something, but the physical distance between Peru and myself right now makes it feel somehow worse. So before I thank my supporters on Patreon, I figured I would end this video with another personal story of mine, one of my most vivid memories of Peru. Growing up in the US, I really only got to see my family in Peru once every few years, and I remembered one time when I was still pretty young, probably 14-ish, and we went to Lima to visit my family. And one day we decided that we would go to a nearby town because it was closer to the beach. And so I got in the family car, my father in front of me, my cousins and brothers around me. And as we were driving, I was probably reading a book or listening to music or something. And after 20-30 minutes, my dad told me in Spanish, "Look, that's how the whole world is." And I looked up from what I was doing out of the window, and driving just a few meters away from the side of this busy road that we were driving on was just a massive hill with a slum stretching out as far as I could see. And I'd seen poverty growing up near Chicago, of course, but this was something completely different. To see just how much of it there was, the extent of how bad it was, the experience of that really imprinted itself on me. To imagine just how many people would be born in this slum and would spend their entire lives on this earth never being able to leave because of systems designed to exploit people exactly like them. I wasn't immediately radicalized, but I remember this is one of the very first moments in my life where I strongly felt that there was something very wrong about our world, even if it took me a few more years to figure out exactly what it was. Anyway, if you like what I do, you can support me at Patreon or buy me a coffee, and before you go, I'd like to thank my current supporters on Patreon. Thank you to Cal, Dirk K, Finn Hammock, CMP6408, Dooley, Almudena Carrasco Pasos, Gabion Ontesi, Dangerman 1973, and Born Again Janice. Thank you for the support, and I'll see you in the next one.